Think we're good? Okay. Hi, everybody. How are you all? My name's Craig Clark. I'm the president of the Portsmouth Historical Society and also a director of the Battle of Rhode Island Association. Just want to welcome you all here tonight to this great event. August 2020, the Historical Society, we held an event. We held an event at Butts Hill Fort. We had a lot of interest at that time from a militia in Long Island and a couple different groups wanting to help out and clear the fort. So we held an event in August during the pandemic, and just to see what kind of interest there was in refurbishing the fort and bringing it back to its glory. And as a result of that, we had very good feedback, and the Historical Society started a group in January of 2021, the Butts Hill Fort Restoration Committee. Some of those members that were starting members, and they're still part of the group: Jim Garment, our town historian; Stephen Luce; Maureen Daniels, our graphic designers, done a fantastic job; Gloria and Richard Schmidt; Jonna Spencer; Nathan Moniz; myself and Joe. Joe and I were named co-chairs at that point. Soon after, we received a donation from the Rhode Island Sons of the American Revolution, provided one of the first donations. And they asked one of their members, retired Marine Colonel Burton C. Quist, to join our ranks. And of course, Burton, Marine Colonel, immediately took charge and took a leadership role with us. And he was instrumental in all aspects of this effort. He worked tirelessly in recruiting partners, volunteers, organizing events, and keeping us on track. This talk is one of the first of many in his honor. He's a really great man, a real gentle giant. He's truly missed. Soon after forming the committee, we had discussions. Like, we're doing a lot of work at the fort, a lot of effort going into this. It wasn't the first time that the fort had been attempted to be restored and eventually gone back into disrepair. And what we saw as a group, Bert, Joe, and I had numerous conversations as to how do we keep this from happening again. And what we found was two missing links in here. We had this huge void about the Battle of Rhode Island on a digital platform or anything in the internet. If you looked at Battle of Rhode Island or Fort Butts, we went somewhere else. So we saw that creating a website and increasing our partnerships, making a statewide effort and going big, was really what was necessary for the Battle of Rhode Island, the Siege of Newport, and talking about this story. And so in the fall of 2021, we created the Battle of Rhode Island Association with that goal of expanding it, creating an educational platform to teach young folks and create more long-term enthusiasts so that 50 years from now, there's some people out there that know about the fort and they're keeping it going and talking about the Battle of Rhode Island. Since that time, the group has held 8 volunteer clearings, most of them headed up by Paul Murphy, raised over $200,000. And kudos to Dr. Murray Norcross for securing the latest $65,000 grant from the Van Buren Foundation. We've created the most comprehensive website relating to the Battle of Rhode Island, including original articles created by Gloria Schmidt and Jim Stearns. Our next phase, some part of that funding from the Van Buren, is to get to the next phase 2, which would be more interactive aspects of the website, leading explorers to different parts of the state and to the different groups. We've developed relationships with over 45 organizations related to the Revolutionary War. Today we have 2 partners in our midst. We have Patrick Donovan of the Varnum Armory, and we have Mrs. J from the Newport Middle Passage Port Marker Program and the NAACP. We've completed a map or conceptual plans of our master plan, and we'll look forward to funding our full master plan this coming year. We've hosted over 12 talks, partner sites, with more to come. Sponsored 4 archaeological surveys in Portsmouth with the oversight of archaeologist Jay Waller. The most significant findings are at the David Reese property. We wanted to publicly acknowledge his gift to the society for the findings that we've had. We've had over four surveys and digs, not digs, but surveys performed locally. Some of those members: Patrick Donovan, Pat Hubble, Brad Bittenbender, Stephen Luce, Murray Norcross, Jared Gaston, Paul Murphy, David Imbriglio. Just want to thank them all. I want to give a special shout out to Joe Studlick, because he has been really a truly driving force with this organization. If you've been part of the group, you've gotten 4 or 5 emails from Joe at 4 in the morning, wondering why we're not doing something more important, or what's the next thing on the agenda. So Joe truly has been the driving force for this organization, keeping us all motivated, encouraged, and pushing forward. I really wanted to stress that because to me, it's fantastic that we started a group during the pandemic, and to accomplish everything that within 3 years is, I just want to thank you all for that. We have, August 19th, we have an event celebrating the 100th anniversary of the saving of the fort. August 19th will mark the 100th anniversary of that. We have more information to come on that event. It's going to be a very exciting time for us. Just want to mention, following the presentation, we'll have a meet and greet with Wade Katz downstairs and some refreshments. And Patrick has an interesting display to show us, along with the David Reese collection downstairs. So please join us for a little bit after following the talk. Wade P. Katz, MARPA, is a president principal for South River Heritage Consulting, LLC. He is a co-project director and principal archaeologist for the Red Bank Battlefield Project. A registered professional archaeologist, he has more than 40 years of experience in the field of cultural resource management. He is a historical archaeologist specializing in history, archaeology, and historic preservation. Formerly a director and principal archaeologist with John Milner Associates, 1993 to 2014, the regional director with Commonwealth Heritage Group. His work experience is also cultural resource management with academic and government agencies. He holds a graduate degree in American history from the University of Delaware. His research interests include history of farmsteads, agricultural landscapes, military history, archaeology, environmental history, African American archaeology, and Middle Atlantic regional history and historic preservation. Without further ado, Mr. Wade. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak. I'm very honored to be up here to be able to speak today. As soon as I get this turned on, I think that's on. So the project I would like to speak to you about tonight is one that I have been involved with. We started this project last summer, so the work that I'll talk about today is the summer of 2022. So cast your minds back to the summer of 2022. And this is an excavation that we did at Fort Mercer in New Jersey. So it's nice to be able to speak. I'm in the second smallest state. I mean, I'm from the second smallest state, so you guys are the smallest. So it's kind of nice to be up here. You know, I feel there's a kindred spirit there with small states. Gloucester County, New Jersey is the owner of this park and the owner of the land that we're looking at here. And so as we did this project, we were tremendously supported by the work of Gloucester County and the Office of Emergency Management, the Office of Parks and Recreation, a number of county organizations and county groups supported the work that we did. It was really, really remarkable. And in addition to that, we were supported by a tremendous number of volunteers in the community that also helped to make sure that this project happened. So we had it was intended to be a public archaeology event, and that was through the county park. So my co-director on this project is Dr. Jen Janofsky. She and I got together on this and decided that we would set this up as a public archaeology event. People could come and register ahead of time. You could be part of the excavation. We would have people register in the morning or the afternoon, and it was going swimmingly. It was a wonderful event. We had good excavation areas going. We were learning something about the fort and the fort ditch. And then on the last day, which is always, anybody who's ever done archaeology, before you hear this story, but you don't really believe it, it actually worked really well on this. Literally the last day of the project, the last hour of the project was when we encountered femurs in the bottom of the fort ditch. And that completely changed what the project was. And then we went kind of from a public archaeology event to something a little more controlled than that, but we still had a lot of volunteer support in order to make that happen. And so what I'll talk about here is that whole process. I'll give you a little bit about the history of the battlefield itself and the battle that happened here and your connection to that, because it's the 2 Rhode Island regiments who are the defenders of Fort Mercer during the American Revolution. And then we'll go from there to the history of the excavation process and something about where we are right now with the human remains, with the work that we're doing on the human remains. This project was funded by the county and by the New Jersey Historical Commission, both very small grants. And actually, once we had the initial grant was the the Historical Commission, and then once the project began to grow, the county matched that grant. So we had two different funding sources that did this. And I will definitely put this in. You need to be aware that in some point in this presentation, it says may include. It does include, okay? So there will be images of human remains in this presentation. If that makes you squeamish, you should be prepared and be ready to leave the space. This is not my intention to offend anybody. We are trying to handle this as with all of the human remains, and everything we have done to this point have been with a level of dignity and respect for everybody that's involved in this project, and with the sets of human remains that we have encountered. So that's just there as the warning. Red Bank Battlefield Park is located in Gloucester County, New Jersey. It's about a 40-acre park, a little over that. They get about 200,000 visitors there a year. It's hard to believe that number of people. Any of you have ever flown into Philadelphia Airport? When you're just about to land coming into Philadelphia, if you look out the left-hand side of the plane, you're looking at Fort Mercer. It's right there across from the airport. If you look directly below you, if you can do that, also coming into the Philadelphia Airport, you're flying over Fort Mifflin. And so Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer were the principal defending fortifications on the Delaware River in 1777. And linking those two spaces was a series of river obstructions, sunken river obstructions that would prevent a fleet from coming up the river. And there behind them, on the upriver side, was a Pennsylvania Navy. Fledgling Navy, and actually it doesn't get the credit it should, but I think as you see this presentation, you'll understand why they should get some credit. They have at the site the James and Ann Whittle House, which was a Quaker family that owned the property where the fort was built. That's another storyline that you could follow in this, how the Quakers handled the fact that they have an extremely brutal engagement and fight and fortification on their land. And then you see that in 1906, you have a large new monument that was put up in 1906. My associate, Jen Janofsky, has done extensive research on the history and development of that monument, and who is excluded from that monument and who is included on that monument. And I can touch on that a little bit as we go. I am remiss if I don't identify the other members of the project team, and I think it's important for you to see them. This project, like any archaeology project, it's often multidisciplinary. You always have cross-disciplinary work on these. This project, because of its change from a kind of public archaeology event to a human remains excavation, we picked up a number of people here that I wouldn't always include on my projects, but you have my second in command here was Dana Link, who is a former National Park Service and FEMA archaeologist. Anna Delaney, Stuart Alexander are both with the New Jersey Department, work with the New Jersey State Police Forensics Lab. And New Jersey State Police actually have a forensic anthropologist on staff. So as we identified human remains, those remains, the chain of custody essentially went from us in the field to her in the police lab. So currently, those human remains are with the New Jersey State Police Forensics Lab, which is probably the safest, most secure place you could keep them right now. We also have involved in this project Dr. Tom Christ from Utica University, and I would say Tom is probably one of the preeminent forensic anthropologists in the United States operating and working today. The gentleman you see in the lower right corner is Dr. David Orr, retired National Park Service archaeologist and a retired Temple University professor, well-known historical archaeologist. We had an input from and help from Heather Hooley, who is also a Westchester University anthropology professor. You see her shown there. A couple of students who came from Westchester who are now becoming professional archaeologists. They were involved in this project. And then other professional archaeology volunteers from the region. So we had a lot of professional support on this, as well as a lot of volunteer support, which you see illustrated here. We had over 100 volunteers involved in the project, and we had hundreds, literally hundreds of hours of volunteer labor that went into this project. When it changed from being the public event that we were doing and to a removal of human remains, I had a core of volunteers who continued to show up day in and day out, week after week after week. So my summer vacation went from I should have been done in June to I was still working on this site in early August. And every day in July, and sometimes 7 days a week, we were over there working on this burial space. So to give you a background on the context of the site and what happened, this is an image of the Philadelphia area, and you can see Philadelphia is here. The fortifications I described are underneath the red circle. This campaign, if you want to push it into the Delaware River Valley at this time, it starts in August. You could push the Philadelphia campaign back into June and May in New Jersey and how it swings down and into the Chesapeake Bay and then up into the Delaware River and all those kinds of things. But I'll give you when they land in August. So the British forces under Sir William Howe, about 17,000 men, come up the Chesapeake Bay and land in this general vicinity. The purpose of this entire campaign is to seize Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the capital of the fledgling United States at that time. The thinking being if you take the capital, that takes off the head of the organization, you take away the government. In this particular situation, the joke was on the British because the American government simply picked up and moved to York and Lancaster and a number of other towns further inland into Pennsylvania. I've worked on other projects there where it's pretty remarkable. A gun factory located in Philadelphia closed in Philadelphia and was reopened within 4 weeks further out into the Pennsylvania backcountry. And literally, it probably was just like picking up the armorers and moving them someplace, setting up a few systems that could be worked, and they were back in business. It was no problem at all. You have a series...
Sorry to interrupt. The Zoom people cannot see the slides.
So it's just a
Can you
matter
help
of
us?
selecting whether they're looking at the camera or at the screen that's being shared from the slide computer.
So what I'm being told is that they have to select that camera. They can pick a camera.
Well, you can pick which you're looking at. Either there's a blocked out camera where we've canceled out
No,
the...
it looks like screen sharing is not
Sharing.
sharing, actually.
We're working on it.
Okay, is it available now as an option?
That's it.
Can you see it now? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, he can
Yes,
see it
thank
now.
you.
Yep, okay.
All right.
Uh,
Run the PowerPoint at the same time.
And the PowerPoint should still work, I hope. We'll see if it does. So what you see is a sequence of engagements that occur here before we ever get to Red Bank Battlefield. One that I am working on myself right now is on the 3rd of September, the Battle of Couch's Bridge, which is down in this portion of Delaware. Then you have 8 days later, the main engagement at Brandywine, which is considered to is the largest land engagement of the American Revolution in terms of space occupied. About 35,000 acres of land. It covers 15 municipalities and 2 counties in Pennsylvania. And in terms of numbers of soldiers engaged, those were probably the points where Washington's army was as large as it was going to get, and Howe's army was also extremely large. A few days later, you have the aborted Battle of the Clouds on the 16th of September, which literally is an engagement where the battle is called, you could almost say it's called on account of rain. Nor'easter blows in, the roads are totally turned to mud. The American forces, literally their cartridge boxes are falling apart. They are poorly produced, badly created. They're losing their ammunition. The British forces cannot attack because the rain is blown into their faces, and both armies kind of split and move off from that. So that could have been a very major engagement, but it doesn't. It never really occurs. It starts and then it stops. Philadelphia is captured on the 26th of September, so it's about a month from when the British forces land at Elk Neck or ahead of Elk to when they capture Philadelphia. But seizing Philadelphia does not end the campaign. The British are holding the capital, holding the city, but you don't have a Royal Navy that can get up the Delaware River to support them, and you need that supply line in order to do it. And what's stopping that are the fortifications at Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer on either side of the river, Those river obstructions, or a chevaux de frise that was in the river in a series of locations, and the Pennsylvania Navy that's sitting behind it. So the whole reason that the Battle of Red Bank is fought is that the British forces are trying to seize that fort. If you take one or either of those forts, you make the other one superfluous, you don't need it anymore, and it has to be abandoned. You still have the Battle of Germantown in there in early October, which is an attempt by Washington to attack kind of an isolated detachment of British forces. And then you have the Battle of Red Bank on the 22nd of October, followed the next day by, and I would say that if you put these 2 days together, this is whatever that phrase is, the very worst, most terrible day kind of thing that the British ever have. Not only do you have the disaster at Red Bank, which is kind of bloodies Hessian brigade, but the next day, a 64-gun frigate, the Augusta, explodes in the Delaware River, the worst explosion, worst disaster the Royal Navy suffers during the war, and another vessel burns and runs aground and burns. So they lose 2 naval vessels the following day. So those 2 days back-to-back couldn't have been very good days for both the Royal Army or the Royal Navy. You have the siege at Fort Mifflin, and Mifflin finally falls on the 16th of November. And when that happens, Fort Mercer can no longer be defended, and so Fort Mercer is abandoned as well. So over that period of time, all of this is happening in the Delaware River Valley. And then those time frames, you may recognize some of those. You have some of the activities that are going on up in the Hudson River Valley with Burgoyne and Saratoga. So these are all kind of occurring at the same time. What just happened? So now I'm not getting... Can you advance me? So the setting where we are, this is a period map that shows you the general area of Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer. This is Philadelphia. At the time, it's probably about 25 or 30,000 people. It's one of the largest cities in North America, if not the largest. It certainly is larger than New York. It is also within the British Empire, one of the largest cities in their colonies. You can see the river and the kind of the way it moves. You've got these fortifications are at a narrow point on the river, and you have a series of obstructions in the river here. This is not an easily navigable river in the first place. You start sinking things in the river, you got to have river pilots who can get you through. It's not an easy space to get through. So the Royal Navy is seated below here. The 2 forts are on either side. And the British send a Hessian column actually out of Philadelphia down the eastern side of the river, and they attack Fort Mercer from the land side. This is one of a series of maps that we have, layout maps of what this fortification looked like. One of the values of doing the archaeology is that I have 4 or 5 of those maps, and every one of them looks different than the other one. They're all contemporary maps. They're all drawn by people who, in theory, were there. So which one is right? And are you looking at different periods of time when they're being drawn? It's kind of a conundrum when you look at them that way. Try moving me forward again. This gives you a current setting of what the area is. Fort Mercer is here. The airport is here. Philadelphia now kind of absorbs all of this space. So this is the area on the Delaware River where we are. Next, please. The defender of the fortification, some of you probably are familiar with this gentleman. This is Christopher Green. He is a cousin of Nathaniel Green. The 2 major principal units that are in the fort at this time are the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments. There is probably a detachment of the 6th Virginia in here. It's hard to know exactly who is in the fort and who isn't, who is and who is not, because the fort is being used as the staging point where you send relief columns over to Fort Mifflin at night. So troops are coming in, the engagement, the siege of Fort Mifflin is occurring, and then at night you'll pull that garrison out, put a new garrison in. So there are people constantly going back and forth across the river, and as long as you have both forts to do that, those forts will hold out, and the obstructions in the river prevent anybody from stopping that movement. There's also an artillery detachment in here commanded by one of the early French officers who has come in and joined the American forces, Captain Madouis Duplessis, and he is the person going to be responsible for building the fort out to look the way it does on the day of the battle. The other thing I would point out to you here is that the 1st and 2nd, and you probably all know this already, but the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island Regiment are integrated regiments fighting at this fort. This is, and again, my co-author or my co-project manager on this, Jen Janofsky, has spent a considerable amount of time looking at the history of those two regiments and how into the 19th century, the presence of African American soldiers fighting at Red Bank is consistently removed from certain writings, and some people recognize it and some people don't. And so that monument I showed you, that 1906 monument, when that is being proposed to be built, there are African American scholars, historians in New Jersey who write to the governor and say, this is a place that you need to recognize that African Americans served in the country, served here and defended this fort. And by the time it gets to the commission who puts that monument together, that story is gone. So 1906 is not considered to be a part of this story. But if you go back in the 19th century and the 18th century, people like James Fortin of Philadelphia, African American, writes, I saw those men march across the river and go defend that fort. I know they were here. So it's a very interesting story from a whole nother perspective. But I thought I would point that one out to you because it's kind of a neat, it's a good story in some ways and a very bad story in others. You see a profile view of the fortification. Red Bank is called Red Bank because it sits on about a 40-foot high bluff above the Delaware River. And any of you who've been in the Delaware River, you're down in coastal plain country. So if you get a 40-foot high bluff, that's a pretty high promontory, if you will, for us. We don't have that. You guys have more elevation here than I have where I live. So. Oh, next, please. Maudoui Duplessis, I mentioned, he is the engineer that works on this. He's a well-trained engineer, French-trained, and a good engineer. He knows what he's doing. He's an artilleryman. He knows what he's doing. He gets to this fort, and he says, the fort that you have is way too big for the size of the defense force. You may have seen there that he had about 500 men, 600 man maximum defense force inside that fort. The fort was about 1,000 yards long on the land side. It has no walls on the river side because the bluff itself serves as sort of as the wall. The wall construction is on the land side of the fort. Duplessis looks at this and he says, there's no way this garrison can defend that fort. I'm going to trim that fort down to a much smaller size. And so he cuts down the fort by about 2/3 of its space, unbeknownst to the Hessian force that's attacking. Next, please. This is Duplessis' map of what he did at this fort. And you can see this interior wall right here. So this is the old trace of the fort. This is this newer space that he builds. And he literally builds this only a few days before the battle starts. They are still working on this literally the morning of the engagement. So Hessian forces attack this fort from the land side here and from the east, the north, and the south. The two forces that come across the exterior walls here and here do not know that this section of the fort has been abandoned. So when they go over those outer walls, they think they've won. They've made it into the fort. The battle is a victory. They're cheering. They've won. They find out that when they get in here, this new wall is something they hadn't seen, and the Pennsylvania naval vessels are firing into their right flank and rear. So it makes for a very destructive battle space. You also see in these that there's an abattis that goes around the exterior of the fort. There's a double abattis on the inside and a caponiere that he builds here, which we're still trying to figure out exactly what that is and how it's going to work on the landscape. Next, please. The force that assaults the fort is a Hessian reinforced grenadier brigade commanded by Emil Karl von Donop. He's a colonel. This is him on the right-hand side. It consists of 3 grenadier battalions and a musketeer regiment. So the grenadier soldiers are your bigger, more robust men. These particular soldiers are drawn from, so the names of these units come from the commanding officer of the unit. So von Lensing, von Minnigerode, and von Lengerke, they are the commanding officers. The units that comprise those, each of those is about 100-man, a little over 100-man company. These are big battalions. There are about 4 companies in each of these, and they are pulled just the same way that the British create a grenadier battalion or a light infantry battalion. You pull a company from each of the known line regiments and you stick them into essentially an ad hoc battalion. This is a very powerful strike force, and if you look at the number of men involved, there's 2,400 men in this brigade. That outnumbers the fort by about 4 to 1. Only about 1,400 men out of this group actually are involved in the fighting, but still, it is a formidable formation to be putting on the land side to attack this fort. Other folks who are involved in this are a Hessian Field Jaeger Corps, and these are the only British forces that are formally attached, 2 Royal Howitzers. Everybody else in this is essentially a Hessian soldier. Next, please. As I mentioned earlier, this is the assault area that you see. The Minigorod Battalion is coming over the northern wall. The Mirbach Fusilier Regiment is attacking the eastern wall, and the Linsing Battalion attacks the south. Again, this shows you very clearly the abandoned section of the fort here, and this is the redoubt or citadel that the French engineer had created. You also see on this red spot is the approximate location of where the sets of human remains are that we identified. Next, please. Losses in this battle are horrendous for the Hessian forces. This battle only takes about 45 minutes. And in that space of time, 151 dead, 266 wounded. That's the official count. That's about 25% of the assault force. In any 18th century engagement, that is an extremely high percentage of casualties. And if you look at the American casualties, you have 14 killed, 21 wounded. That is about as lopsided a victory as you're going to see for the Americans. It's a fantastic victory for the Americans. And that was, in the background there is one of the plaques that is actually on site there, and then you can see here the names, we know who the names of the Rhode Island Regiment soldiers who were killed and wounded on this site. This is the lieutenant colonel who takes over the column after all of the von Donop, I should add. Von Donop is mortally wounded and captured. Three of the 4 battalion commanders are mortally wounded or killed outright. High percentage of officer casualties, so that the man who takes over is the Jaeger commander. That's who you see here. Von Wurm, and this is one of his comments, "It's painful for me to lose so many good people." You read the reports, they're kind of after-action reports, and you get the sense that these individuals were suffering from PTSD before anybody understood what that was. You can clearly see it in their writings about what happened to them in this engagement. Next, please. So the area that we looked at, the green outline is the older section of the park. Remember, I think I mentioned when we started this, I mentioned it to Jay, I probably didn't say it out loud to everybody here. The whole purpose behind this project was that this is a little new quarter-acre lot that was going to be added to the existing park. The park has been here since about 1905, 1906. This park was actually created at a time, prior to that, it was owned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They had a site that they occupied here. They were getting ready to sell this, and it was going to go into private hands when the community in the area felt that it was important to retain. And when Theodore Roosevelt, president at the time, says the U.S. government is too big to sell battlefields. We're not going to do that. So instead, they deeded over to the county, and the county's historical society is literally created at this time to be the maintainer and the steward of this park. So it goes clear back into the early 20th century that this park is created. I would add, too, that you don't see it here. I showed you that 1906 monument. There is another monument in this park that was created in 1829, and it's probably within the top 4 or 5 in the United States that are put up in that era, in that early 19th century to commemorate activities of the American Revolution. You have several in this section of the country. Down where we are, Paoli Battlefield is 1817. This is 1829. That's about as early as you're going to have those kind of monuments put up. So this is a quarter-acre lot in the borough of National Park. So you're in a community, but this particular lot didn't have any buildings on it at this time. Go ahead. This is kind of what it looked like at the time. It's not as easy for you to see, but we did, prior to the work, we did ground penetrating radar and we did some metal detection. This view, these are nearly identical views. This clearly shows in the background that is the fort ditch in the current county park area. It's very deep. It's very, very well defined. It's very deep and well defined because during the WPA era, 1930s, the Emergency Relief Administration came in and enhanced that ditch. Now, I'm not exactly sure what they did. I've seen some photographs of what they did, but I've never seen anything in writing about what they did. I'm pretty sure they never hit any human remains, because had they hit human remains, they would have reported that. Somebody would have known that. There's nothing in there that says that they had any human remains. But the ditch in this section, the fort ditch, is very well defined. But you see in the foreground, this shallow space here and here, that's what the ditch looked like on this quarter-acre lot. So the whole reason we wanted to look at this was to sample that fort ditch, get a sense of the way the fort might have been built here. My intent was to do a series of excavations across it that would get me a profile across the ditch, from the inside of the fort to the outside of the fort wall, and you'd be able to see kind of how the fort is built, how the ditch is constructed. Fun information, right? Stuff that should be enjoyable to learn about. And the GPR did identify an anomaly in the bottom of the ditch, but it wasn't clearly definable as sets of human remains. It was definable by a jumble of something. And at this point, knowing that this fortification had been occupied for about 7 months and abandoned rather rapidly, the potential for what was in that ditch would be the leftover detritus of having occupied a fortification for the length of time that it was used, 6 or 7 months. And we know from the records that a lot of material was left on site. The Americans didn't have time to get it out. They just simply left it in place. And another one of the anomalies we had turned out to be a 55-gallon drum that was buried off to one side much later, and my GPR operator, who was very excited about that, wanted that to be a cannon. She wanted that to be a cannon in the worst possible way. Next, please. So this gives you an idea of the excavation pattern that we did. You see the large unit off to the side. That's where our 55-gallon drum actually turned out to be. These units are actually laid out across the ditch. So I'm standing on the inside of the fort wall, and you're looking out towards the exterior portion of the wall. Our human remains and burial area ended up in this space. And we eventually opened up a space here that was about 30 feet long and 10 feet wide. So all we did was a sampled space of the fort ditch. Go ahead. Yes, please. I'm sorry. This gives you an idea of what that looked like when we finished it. The photograph you see on the right shows you that 10-foot wide space and 30 feet long. The drawing on the left indicates for you in those red dots are crania. Every one of those is where we identified the portions of a crania. And I say they're portions because that's pretty much what we have. We have mandibles and maxilla, and that's about it. Very few individuals here survive beyond that. And as I go through this, what you'll see is that these are not full individuals. These are not full skeletons. These are partial sets of remains. So in no way could you consider this to be a graveyard, not a traditional graveyard that you have shafts and individuals laid in shafts. That is not what we saw here at all. And you can see in this that the fort scarp wall is at the upper side, is here. So the scarp fortification wall would have been here. The rampart would have been here. The ditch space is about 13 feet across, and this is the exterior portion of the ditch. Next, please. I want to talk a little bit about the fort because you all have a fantastic fortification here, so I want to give you a little bit of background on the fort that we had. This fort that we were looking at was built by a Pennsylvania militia colonel, John Bull. And I have to say that this statement is probably one of the most damned with faint praise statements I think I've ever seen in any piece of writing. This is written by Major General Ducoudray, who is another one of the French officers who comes. And you'll see in that bold section there, Ducoudray was not happy with any of the forts that he saw on the Delaware River, and he's reporting this back to Washington, June 1777. He doesn't like Fort Mifflin, so that's the one that the big siege is fought on. He thinks Fort Mifflin is useless and not going to be able to do anything. There's another fort a little further down the river. He actually liked that one. He wasn't too mad about that one. But this one, he says, this one is better conceived than those other two, and it does more honor to Colonel John Bull, as he had no other assistance than natural good sense, unenlightened by theory. I mean, I'd like to be able to use that in all kinds of conversations with people. If you can figure out a way to stick that in your conversation, I think you should. So Ducoudray does not survive much beyond this. He accidentally drowns in the Schuylkill River. And so there are a lot of people who probably feel that removing him might have been a good thing. It didn't happen on purpose, it was accidental. But it kind of opened up. There were a lot of people who were not happy with him in the way that he dealt with things. Next, please. So the fort, you see two profile views here on the left and the right. These are actually profile views of the fort that we have. And so part of what we were going to try to do was figure out, do we actually have this kind of a configuration? You see it again here. And I believe the way this one is drawn, you remember I mentioned that you have an interior fortification wall and the older wall. This is probably the original outer wall, and this is that newer interior wall that is built. This crosses very close to the space where we were doing the excavation, according to the profile drawing the way it is presented. And this is Redoubt 9 at Yorktown. We are supposed to have the phrase like this that comes out. You see them here in the drawing. This would be similar to what you'd have. And you're familiar with an earthen fortification. The dirt that comes out of the ditch becomes your rampart wall or your parapet wall. So our ditch, if it's 8 feet deep, has a wall that's 8 feet high. So if you're standing in the bottom of the ditch, it's 16 feet to the top of the wall. So it's, again, a fairly formidable space. The issue that I still have on this, because we didn't find it yet archaeologically, and we're hoping to find it, we're doing work right now at Red Bank again in a different section of the fort. I don't know how that wall is held up, because with a wall that big and that much soil, and this soil is very sandy. So how do you prevent that wall from, no sooner you get it piled up than it starts dropping right back into your ditch? There should be a framework of some kind that holds that wall in place. And a little bit of excavation we did, I never saw evidence of a framework. There's no obvious wooden framing. There's a possibility that maybe they're using gabions to hold the wall in place. Another statement that we have here is that the fort was incomplete at the time of the attack. And so I just happened to be digging in a section of the fort that was incomplete. I don't have that evidence of how they built the wall because they hadn't gotten that far yet and they just hadn't finished the fort. Next, please. So this is what we saw when we excavated, and I think you should be able to see this clearly. This is the scarp wall itself. The fortification wall, the rampart would have been here on this side of the slide. This break in the soil was extremely easy to see. That was extremely hard, dense packed. You knew it when you hit it. So as we excavated down, that soil had been solid and packed in like that for a long time. That slope is not something we created. That is something that was there in the ground when we excavated it. This is the bottom of the fort ditch, and you get a sense of what the soil profile is here. This is about 4.5 feet down to the bottom of the ditch. The surface material in here was about 1890s to 1930s mix of material. Underneath of that, and this is, unfortunately, this is pretty dry, but you'll have to take my word for it on this one. This section in here is the former ditch of the fort wall slumping back into that ditch and beginning to fill that space. The bottom 6 to 8 inches of soil is where the human remains and the battle-related material were located. So, and actually it shows up really clearly on my slide here. It's not as clear for you up there. Next, please. You may all know this gentleman, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Ward. He's at the fort. He makes one of the first reports about the Hessian casualties and indicates that he's seeing a lieutenant colonel, 3 captains, 4 lieutenants, nearly 70 rank and file killed. Count von Donop, the commanding officer, his brigade major, a captain lieutenant, and another 70 wounded. Now, you saw those other numbers, that clearly those numbers go up after the battle, and this is only the very first report that he makes to George Washington right after the engagement. Go ahead. What about treatment of the dead? How do we know what happened here to the dead? You have three statements here that were presented by Rhode Island soldiers who were there. You have the first statement from one of the commanding officers of the 2nd Rhode Island. The day after the battle, they're busy burying the dead soldiers. He says, "This day was spent the greatest part in bringing in the slain and burying them and taking proper care of the wounded." Sergeant John Smith, 1st Rhode Island, says, "On the 23rd in the morning, we began to strip and bury the dead of our men and Hessians. We buried 75 Hessians in one grave in the entrenchment and covered them over, and 8 or 10 more below the bank by the river. It took us all day to bury the dead." Remember, that battle with the Augusta is going on the 23rd as well. So there's a lot happening at Red Bank, right? You're cleaning up after the battle. You're still in fire from the Augusta. There's a naval engagement happening. And then Jeremiah Greenman, you probably are familiar with him. He says, "The forepart of this day employed ourselves in burying the dead, 73 in one grave and 4 or 5 in another." We have about a half a dozen statements like this of where the burials were going and what was happening. Next, please. And where were these bodies being placed? So the map you see on the right-hand side is from Johann Ewald's journal, and he identifies there the translation, and circled in red, graves of the officers who have been shot dead. So he's placing those bodies. You can see the fort here. He's placing graves below the fort, closer to where the Whitehall House is. And the map that you see on the left-hand side is from Benson Losing's volume on the American Revolution. And you see where he places the graves here and von Donop's grave below the fort. Keep in mind that the area we worked on was up in this area, not down here. There was no evidence that there should have been anybody buried up in that area. Now, I can use hindsight and retrospect and, it makes a lot of sense. And as we describe this, I think you'll understand why it makes a lot of sense. Go ahead. So, what is the treatment of the dead in the 18th century? On a battlefield. Not in a hospital setting, but on a battlefield. And this is work that Robert Selig and some of you are probably familiar with Bob through the W3R work that he does. We kind of put this context together a couple years ago because we've done a lot of these battlefields together. Burials are generally carried out by whoever still holds the ground afterwards. The season of the year always influences that, how long you can be on the land after the battle has been fought. It also depends on who composes the burial party, but really significant here is bodies are generally stripped of clothing, weapons, accoutrements. You're generally buried naked or with small clothes only. If you have shoes, boots, uniform coats, anything that can be usable, you're going to take that off of the dead and you bury them. Often there are multiple burial sites on the battlefield, and often officers and enlisted men are buried in the same space. There's no distinction once you're dead, whether you're an officer or you're a soldier, unless, of course, you're being buried by your own side, and then they may make that distinction. They are very often quick and expedient burials. You are looking for a shallow hole in the ground. As long as you can find that hole, you will put somebody in there and cover them with sticks, leaves, anything, and just leave them. So we based this work not only on the archaeological data that we had, but also on, we kind of combed all of the first-person accounts we could find. And so you come across statements, particularly in New Jersey, and you may have them here as well, that a year or so after the battle, you'll find sets of human remains in the roadside ditches. And so as somebody's moving along on a cart 2 years after the battle, they're riding over hands and feet and things that are sticking out of the ditch because they never got buried correctly in the first place. So they are often very shallow graves. Next, please. So now I want to take a look at those Hessian losses. We've talked a little bit about who we know who were casualties. This is another statement by Johann Ewald where he actually describes the wounded men that came back to Philadelphia. So after they attacked that fort, and they pull back, that whole column of wounded and still functioning Hessian soldiers have to get back across the Delaware River, and they're very concerned that they may be attacked en route. They're not very strong anymore. They've been beaten pretty badly. But this is the list of wounds that he is describing of people who came back. So you read through these. You have right leg shot apart, both legs shot to pieces, shot through both legs, shot through the chest and right arm, through the leg, in the arm, right arm shot off, through the left leg, through the neck and head, left foot smashed, right leg shot to pieces, right knee smashed, and in the left knee. Now, reading that is one thing, right? And you can see it in his journal, and it's written black and white. What he describes is what I was seeing in the bottom of that excavation trench. Next, please. What can cause that kind of damage? This is the Pennsylvania Navy, and this is where I mentioned earlier on that I don't think they get the recognition for really breaking up that assault that they did. Clearly, you could be hit by musket fire from the Rhode Island regiments, and we clearly have evidence of that as I go through this. We have 20-some musket balls that we recovered. Every one of those musket balls was an impacted shot. Every one of them was from a Charleville musket. So those of you who are doing research on the Rhode Island Regiment, I'd love to know when they get their Charleville muskets, because we didn't see anything else in there but Charleville. So that tells me that all those French muskets that were coming into New England, those 2 Rhode Island regiments must have gotten them pretty early, because they're down there with us on the Delaware River. But you look at this list of vessels, these are galleys. These are galleys. They're row galleys. They sit pretty low in the water. They all only have 1 cannon. And you kind of look at that and you go like, 1 cannon? Like, what can 1 cannon do? But look at the size of those guns. You have 18-pounders, 24-pounders, and one of them has a 32-pound gun. So that means it's firing a ball that's a 32-pound, weighs 32 pounds, or 18 or 24. They're not going to be firing solid shot in this assault. They're going to be using something that is more anti-personnel weapon. Go ahead. Now, we also have, remarkably, a powder horn drawing from John Burlingame of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. When we were doing this project, this is from a private collection. When we were doing this project, the executive director of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, Scott Stevenson, came over to visit us on the site. And once he saw what was in the bottom of the excavation, he got back to his office. He immediately sent me these photographs. And he said, I completely forgot. We had this on display not 4 or 5 months ago in the museum. Burlingame is at Red Bank, and he is drawing in that image, in very primitive fashion, what he saw on the battlefield. You have a decapitated body. You have severed legs, severed arms. He is drawing it and you look at this and you kind of go, he's just drawing that. No, this is what he saw. This is exactly what he saw. Next slide, please. This is just another version of the same, but you get a sense of what it was that he saw on that battlefield after it happened. Go ahead. What can cause that kind of damage? You look at the statement that Lieutenant Levin Karl von Heister is making. We had 2 ships which could not be seen that were firing chain shot into the flank. The latter knocked down whole rows of men. Chain shot, if a naval engagement, is great for taking down ships' masts, great for taking out rigging, but in an anti-personnel engagement, what's it going to do? Take off your legs, take off arms, take off heads. And that's what we have in the bottom of that ditch. Go ahead. So now we'll come back to that space. All of the yellow stars mark those crania that we identified. Those are not laid out in rows. Those are just kind of put in the bottom of the hole. The young woman on the right-hand side, she's at the top of the scarp wall. So that black line here marks the scarp and slope. This is the red lines mark the bottom of the ditch. And this line, I think, this is the bottom of the ditch. So it's 13 feet across. What we found as we did this work was that there's a shelf out beyond this, just beyond the ditch, that it didn't, unlike the ditch edges, which were pretty clean and distinct, and you could see them, when we got out on that edge, we were about 5 to 6 feet away, and it feathered a lot, and it wasn't consistent, and every time I thought we could follow it, it would disappear. And I think if you have to bury bodies in the bottom of that ditch, where are you going to get the soil from to do that? You're not going to go to the scarp wall. You're not going to go there. You're going to go to the counterscarp, and you're going to take the soil that's on the outside. So I think what we picked up was that little bit of space where the men who went down that ditch went down the outer edge and threw soil from the outside of the ditch to bury the bodies. Next, please. So this is what we saw when we were in the bottom of the ditch. This is Anna Delaney, you see there in a couple of those slides, working on several of the sets of long bones on the left-hand side. In the middle, Right now, these people are in it. These sets of human remains are identified by number. This is number 7. Number 7 is probably the best preserved individual we have. Number 7 was laying up actually against the scarp wall, right at the base of the scarp wall. Number 7 is face down. You can see there that he has a little bit of the cervical vertebra are here, scapulas, and then his rest of his vertebral column is missing. It's gone. He's laying on, in his right hip was a musket ball. Kind of in the middle of his back was a lead canister shot. And he's laying on his left arm, and there was an iron grape shot lodged in his left arm. So this individual had been hit at least 3 times. The group that you see on the other side, on the right-hand side, are another series of long bones. And what we see here is you'll have a series of long bones, and then a few inches away will be some acrania. So we're missing sections of human body. They're just not there. We just have only parts. Next, please. And in some situations, we have musket balls in direct association or close association with the bone. I can't say that in any of the long bones that we've looked at that we have seen the impact that musket ball had, like it hit the bone, but these are so close that in all likelihood these have hit the body in some way and have kind of ended up in the deposit with them. Next, please. So what do we know so far? And this is likely to change. We're still in the process of analyzing the sets of human remains that we have. We have a number of studies that are still going to be done. I can tell you right now that all of the bone has been processed at this point, so all of the crania elements are done, and all of the long bones have been processed. We have a minimum of 15 individuals. So if you had heard all the reports that we had back in August, we had thought we had 13. I actually knew at the time we had 14, but I didn't want anybody to know that because there was one guy still in the bottom of the ditch before the press conference started. Number 15 actually showed up in with number 1. And so that shows you how mixed some of these were, that once we began. So in order to excavate these, and you kind of see it here, we brought these, they are in very poor condition. The bone is very fragmented. To analyze these, we kind of removed bone in, and I still haven't gotten a better word than clump for a scientific term, but essentially we'd remove them in a clump of soil and then process that clump in the police forensics lab. So that's how number 15 showed up, because as we worked on this, we suddenly found that we had teeth that didn't belong with the mandible that we had somebody else. They are all male, young to early middle-aged adults. Right now, the evidence suggests that they are all European descent. The bone preservation is fair to poor, but we have an amazing selection, assemblage, I'd say, of teeth. And you can do a lot with teeth for all kinds of studies. Next, please. What kind of artifacts did we get? We only have about 100 artifacts that are in that bottom 6 to 8 inches of soil. We did recover clothing, buttons, things that go with your clothes. Brass, pewter, repoussé button. You see I think the repoussé button is in the upper right. We also have a cuff link that just showed up as we were finishing the processing of the human remains. So in some cases, we had buttons that were in situ. You can see a series of them laid out. The pewter was in such bad shape that it never registered as metal anymore. So we would often go down and do a metal detector space. When you were down on a set of human remains, you want to detect to see if there's anything in there. We would detect that, and the pewter wouldn't even show up as metal. So it had deteriorated to the point where those buttons weren't going to be in the ground much longer. We also have some fabric fragments. Oof, I should have worded that differently. And possibly leather. So we're not sure which that's going to be, so we're going to try to do analyses of those fabric fragments and see what we can get. We know the way, for example, in a regimental coat, the way those are put on is that you actually have them kind of on a leather strip, so it's a lot easier to move those buttons off. You don't sew them on as individual, you kind of have them as part of the strip, and the strip can come off. We might be picking up some of either the string or the fabric that held them on. So this actually, you remember I said earlier, you strip the body of any usable material. So we were getting buttons in clusters. And so my working hypothesis right now is that those buttons are probably from uniform coats that are being used to clean up the material that you're finding on the battlefield. So if I sent you out there to go clean that battlefield up, you're going to go, I'm not touching that, but I'll put it in a coat, and I'll use the coat, and I'll throw everything into the bottom of the ditch. That's why we're getting these clusters of buttons, because in other places we get no buttons at all, and then suddenly you'll get a group of buttons. So we got about 40 or so buttons out of this excavation. Next, please. The types of buttons I think are really interesting. And some of you may have seen these before. The sites that I've worked on in the past, these are not what a Hessian regimental button looked like, at least not the ones I have seen. You see this? This is one that we got from the field. It looks just like this. So it's got that little indentation rim like this. This is a coat from Frederick the Great's army, 1786. And that button is this button. So our buttons look like these, which look like those. So I'm thinking that right now we may be looking at, next please, we might be looking at the Mirbach Regiment here, which could be dressed very differently from the way the Grenadiers are. In the areas that I looked at Red Bank Battlefield the last time, that is not what my buttons looked like. They were large, flat, the kind that are typical for a Hessian uniform. Hessians don't have regimental marked buttons. Just background. Okay. Ooh, did I do that?
No,
Okay, that's all right. Good. I was hoping it was working. Munitions. 20 impacted musket balls, as I said earlier. All 20 of those are the right caliber, right bore for the Charlottesville musket. Only one was unfired. So every one of those was impacted. It hit a target. Only one is an unfired ball. It's a larger caliber ball. And it came out of a group of artifacts. So I think it came with 2 gun flints, a button, and an unfired ball, which still had black residue on the outside of it. So I'm thinking we have gunpowder, and we've tested it for gunpowder to see if that's what it is. I suspect that it's a musket ball that was in somebody's pocket that ended up in the bottom of the ditch, along with, or it's in a little pouch of some kind, because the flints are in there, the button is in there, the ball is in there. It's all kind of clustered together. We also have a couple iron grape shot, at least one lead canister shot, those 2 gun flints I just mentioned, and a fragment of a gun screw off of one of the weapons. But that's pretty much it for the weaponry. And that's the largest kind of artifacts, kind of grouping of artifacts we're getting. So that my initial thought that we would have material that was part of an abandoned fort, we're not seeing that here at all. I don't have any ceramics, I don't have any glass, I don't have any of the things that could easily have been thrown into a fort ditch by a garrison that was living there over any period of time. Next, please. Some of you may have heard that we found a King George III 1776 gold guinea. In my 40-some years of archaeology, I have never seen that, certainly not in an excavation. It was really amazing, and it also was down near the bottom of the ditch. That guinea is worth more than a month's wage for the average Hessian private soldier. So that begs the question, like, who's carrying that? Is that an officer? All these things have been suggested. Is it something that you hid in your coat someplace and it ends up in the bottom because it's in one of those coats that they're using to carry things and throw in the bottom? Is it hidden in your boot? We have a lot of leg fragments in the bottom of that hole. Maybe it is something like that. Is it a keepsake? Somebody had suggested it's a keepsake or a talisman or a good luck piece. Could be any of those things. I'm going to move to the next one. It may also be this. And this is a statement. This is one of these kind of statements, folk statements, if you will, that get made in the 19th century that now make me want to go back and find out where this statement comes from. Because this is an odd thing to say. This is a man, you see him here, John Fanning Watson is a Philadelphia kind of antiquarian. He goes around the area and he collects up stories and he begins to write these in the 19th century. You see this one is written in 1832. He's out on the Brandywine battlefield, which is only about 30 miles out from Philadelphia, and easily something he could get to. And he says, the battleground of Brandywine may still be visited at the Birmingham Meeting House of Friends, Quakers. It is also the place, I'm adding this parenthetically, this is one of the highest density places, battle sections of the Brandywine battlefield. So then he says, if you may see the gravedigger turning up the grave ground, you may possibly see the bones of some British soldier at only 2 feet under the ground. So that in itself gives you an idea of depth of burials, right? It's not going to be very far. But then he says, you may even be shown some old gold coin found concealed once in the great queue of a buried Hessian. So the queue is your hair. Now, then you read that line and you go, how many heads do I have in the bottom of that hole? I've got 15 potential crania, what's left of crania. If that was concealed in your queue, I'm not sure that I would be the guy that would go through that to try to find that gold coin. And that could be why it ends up in the bottom of that hole. Now, I'd like to know more about where John Fanning Watson gets this from. He states this as if everybody knows this, right? Everybody living around Philadelphia knows this is what happens with a Hessian. They keep hair in their queue. How do you know that? So, if any of you ever done research in that direction, I'd be happy to hear it because I really want to follow that one up and see if we can't find out where that statement comes from. Next, please. So we're in the process, as I said, of analyzing the human remains. We've been doing X-rays and CT scans of all of the cranial fragments that we have. We are going to be doing mitochondrial DNA and DNA samples. We're about to send off 5 samples to see if we can get those off of 245-year-old sets of human remains. We will be doing stable isotope analysis, which help with diet and location of where these soldiers may have come from. We've done some blood residue analysis. We're going to try to do the standard kind of pathologies, sex, age, stature. We're still in the process of artifact work. We just got a grant from the New Jersey chapter of the Society of Cincinnati to begin some of the conservation on a group of some of those artifacts. So that literally just came through earlier this week. So that conservation has to be done. We also are going to be doing a lot more historical in-depth research. And ultimately, reinterment and commemoration will happen here. Go ahead. So that processing, the remains are removed down. We peel off that soil matrix that you can see on the right-hand side Anna is working on. They are measured, photographed, cataloged. We try to identify what bone that is. And then, as I said, CT scans and X-rays whenever possible to go. Okay. We did blood residue analysis, and this was kind of interesting because this is something the police lab was willing to do for us because they do this in a crime scene investigation anyway, right? So they know how to do this, and this Kasselmeyer test, the KM test, is the one, it's a presumptive test, but it's the one they use in crime scenes today. So there are other tests. There's a luminol test, for example, that's been applied on archaeological samples. You kind of have to go through a number of other steps. This one is sort of a reagent test where you have 3 different cleaning processes and a reagent. And if it tests positive for blood, it'll turn pink and it'll be really obvious. So in the field, that you see the young woman up in the right corner there, in the field they came out and they tested a number of the musket balls that we had recovered. And this was before we had human remains in the bottom of the hole, right? So we were just thinking it was going to be an interesting test. The musket balls didn't test positive. We tested the grape shot. That didn't test positive. They tested that knee buckle that you see there, and that tested positive for blood. Now, that doesn't mean that is definitely blood, but it means it's testing positive for the chemical reaction or the way that brass buckle like that might begin to deteriorate, and it gives off the same kind of false positive that the blood would be giving off. However, in the lab now, we've tested more musket balls, knee buckles, and buttons. And all 3 of those have tested positive for blood residue. So that's 3 different metal types. And if you can get that off of 3 different metal types, that may mean that initial test we did actually is blood residue. Blood residue can also lead us to DNA testing. So we might have another way to get to DNA. Next, please. Serology and trace analysis. I just mentioned the Kasselmeyer test. It's now been on all those different shots. The gunpowder residue I mentioned earlier. And we are also doing scanning electron analysis, microscopic analysis of some of the musket balls. So we're trying to get as much of this information out of these artifacts as we can. Next. Other samples, other things we're doing, we're going to use the DNA. The teeth are going to be the best thing we have to work with. We are, as I said, about to send out 5 samples of those to see. That will include number 7, who I described as laying up along the wall, and several others who are probably our best candidates for trying to get DNA. The isotopic analysis actually helps you with diet and migration patterns, so we might actually know if these individuals, where in Europe they're coming from, we might be able to do that. And then the nitrogen and carbon-13 dating will also be done for part of this. Next, please. And one of the things that I think is really exciting is 2 of those individuals we have are going to be candidates for digital facial reconstruction. So number 7, who I described, is up against the wall. His full skull is there. So he's got eye orbits, he's got nose, everything is there. You can see. Number 9 is the other one that we can do that with. And so these 2 individuals who went into this ditch 245 years ago with no ceremony and nobody cared, we're going to know who these guys are and what they look like, which will be really exciting. That's currently under work with the artists. The artists are enlisted troopers with the New Jersey State Police. And I have to say, they have been tremendously supportive of the work we're doing. They're very excited at this project. So, they spend a lot of time on modern crime scenes. This is really fun. They're having a good time with all the kinds of things that they can do here. Looking for gunpowder on a 245-year-old musket ball was pretty exciting. And doing digital facial reconstruction on these people, they're very excited. So hopefully we'll be able to put a face to these men. Next, please. We're going to come back now to Johan Ewald. This is him at a much later date in his life. He's a lieutenant general in the Danish army at this point. But this is one of those people who was at the battle on that day. And I mentioned that, you're probably beginning to see the sense of PTSD. He indicates here, and this is putting us back to trying to put faces to these men. And this is the whole reason we were trying to do this work is I want to be able to identify who these people were. There are probably families in Germany that don't even know that they lost somebody at Red Bank Battlefield 245 years ago. We really want to know who those people are. So Ewald, it was an especially sad day for me. I lost 5 of my oldest friends, and 4 of my best friends were severely wounded. He's not even in the battle like they were. He's there, he's engaged, but not like many of these soldiers were. As long as I have served, I have not left the battlefield in such deep sorrow. Next. Another new step that we're doing, just this year, 2023, we received an incubation grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. And that grant is going to allow us to bring on the 2 scholars that you see here, Dr. Robert Selig, who some of you may know, and supporting that work will be Dr. Friederike Baer, who is a PhD, just wrote a book on the Hessians. Some of you may have seen that as well. So this allows us to really build in that story the historical component of this. And in particular, we want to kind of move our research to the other side of the Atlantic and find out who the individual soldiers are that comprise those regiments that fought at this battle, and what's the effect of this battle on the communities that they came from. So what happens when your son doesn't come home or your husband doesn't come home? How does that get reported back in a small village in Germany, and how do you learn about that? What's that long-term effect? What happens in an individual's estate, or if the property needs to be sold and it's not in their name? I mean, all the kinds of things that we could follow up on is like, what's the effect of this engagement on those families? And the document that you see listed there, the Hetrina, that's the abbreviation. It was a document or a database that was created in the 1970s by the Marburg Archives in Germany, which provides you basically information on individual soldiers, their town, the age when they were recruited, their rank, the regiment they served in, and for our purposes, whether they were killed in action and where were they killed. And so we actually can use that information to help us narrow down those DNA searches that we're going to do. Because if we do get DNA back, we don't know if we're going to find somebody that matches it, a modern population or not. But if we know that group of names that we have to work with, we're really going to have a much tighter group to work with. So, next, please. And I'll leave you with this quote, which is kind of serendipitously came out at the same time we were doing the work that we were doing. Roger Cohen was writing for the New York Times, and he's actually writing about a mass grave, mass burial in the Ukraine. But you read this, and it is applicable to Red Bank. Every culture wants to memorialize its dead. Every family needs the missing to be identified to reach closure. Perhaps that is why a wartime mass grave offends something so deep in the human conscience. Any mass grave demands of our humanity the reconstitution of the individual's lives ended here. That's what we're trying to do on this project. And so we're continuing that work. And as we go here, you're going to see more of that kind of background and more of that information. The ultimate goal here will be to reinter these men, these remains, on the battlefield as close to that spot literally, I'd be very happy if we went right back into the space in the ditch where we were, but they're not going to be forgotten this time. We're going to recognize that they are there. We have had conversations with the German embassy. We've had conversations with what amounts to the state archaeologist, like the SHPO archaeologist in Hesse, has also contacted us. And at this point, we're just kind of in conversation with each other. But as we get closer to what that process might look like, we'll be able to figure out how that level of commemoration, memorialization will occur. And most certainly, Germany and its descendant populations will probably be involved in that. So I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to take them. Thank you. Yes?
You said that you identified 15, and I remember reading an article that they said that some of them have been washed in the river. And your map showed, it looked like it was close to the, you're talking about 150 odd bodies. Any idea
Where the others
where
are?
out there?
So I didn't talk about that, but in the work that we did in 2015, we did an American Battlefield Protection Program grant study of Red Bank Battlefield. And in that portion of the study, it looks like about 120 feet of riverfront has eroded back from what the river used to be to where it is today. So if you see an aerial image of the park now, there is a riverfront beach, like a beachfront park area, grassed and has a seawall and benches and everything. That was created in the 1980s, and that literally pushes the beach back to about where it was in 1777. Between 1777 and about 1865, anybody who was in that embankment eroded into the river and is gone. You also had the situation where, and if you ask the Whittle family that lived in the house, they will say that it was I think she refers to them as the myrmidons from Philadelphia, will come down and steal bones and take bones and anything that's washing out of the river face. So the large grave that we think was south of the fort between the Whittle house and the fort seems to be gone and into the river. One of the things we've just done this summer is ground penetrating radar through the rest of the fort ditch. So we had done some areas in the fort in 2015, but we hadn't done the length of the fort ditch. And having now found them in one section of the fort ditch, I'm a little gun shy that I don't want to be back in that fort ditch and finding additional individuals, at least not yet. If there are them to be found, we'll be glad to do that, but we need to know what's in the bottom of the ditch. Right now, that GPR suggests that we don't have anybody else in sections, at least the sections that we've looked at.
Do you have any questions on Zoom that we can find, or anyone?
Oh, do I get them this way? Can I see them? How do I do that?
You can ask people to speak up.
Or the chat in the top with a red 5 on it. Yeah, oh, there's definitely one.
Oh, so we have one here, yeah. How do I do that?
You have to be able to laptop.
Oh,
Has it been there for a while?
how do I get them?
I can ask you.
Oh, all
directly.
right, sure.
Hi, Wade. This is Bob Wong from North Jersey Roundtable.
Yes.
We heard that soldiers that died are stripped of their clothing and weaponry, etc. But what happened to the mitre hats that the Hessians wore? Because it doesn't seem to me that they would be of any utility to the Continentals unless they melted them down. And mitre hats are very rare.
Yes.
From what I understand. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can. That's a good question. So when we did the work in 2015 in the park, and I could have included this, I probably should have, we began to recover teeny little pieces of repoussé brass, like Rococo decorated brass. And they're like flower decorations and odd little brass decorations. And I'm going like, what the heck are they? Like, what are these doing on this battlefield? You start to look at Hessian mitre caps, and they are the fragments of the brass caps. So we were picking up kind of the leftover pieces of those brass caps. There is a report in the Peter Force archives about recovery, and it's written in late November, I think, of 1777, that reports the recovery of old Hessian caps, I think is the way it's worded, and it's several hundred that have been brought in and kind of put in the arsenal at Allentown, Pennsylvania. And you're like, what are they collecting? What are these? I think, given its timing, they seem to have gone around the battlefield and policed that and pulled those brass caps. Now, what they're going to use them for, I'm not sure. Some regiments, there are some units that I've seen a pension record for a man who says that he fought at Princeton and he actually had a grenadier's cap. And he's an American soldier wearing a grenadier's cap on the Princeton battlefield. And he was wearing cap number 10, and his friend was wearing like cap number 7, and that's how they identified each other, was based on the number that was in the cap. It's the only place I've ever seen that described that way, but clearly he was wearing a mitre cap or a grenadier's cap, which I thought was kind of odd for a New Jersey militiaman. I think he's New Jersey militia. But if that kind of answers your question, we did find bits and pieces of them on the battlefield. I think that any usable one was probably picked up and used and taken off the field if they could do it.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, is that all of them?
Well, I think we're going a little bit late.
Oh, all right. I'm sorry.
I mean, maybe we can, if people want to contact you directly.
Sure. So if you want to reach me directly, my email is Wade, my name, Katz, Catts, @gmail.com. So I'll be glad to answer questions if I can. Other than that,
Thank you very much.
good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So to make sure we can hear.
Okay.
So on behalf of the Portsmouth Historical Society and the Battle of Rhode Island Association, we have a couple of mementos for
thank you.
And again, when you're outside,
Oh,
please
very
wear
good.
that
I will certainly do that.
at the site. We also have some books
Oh,
here,
excellent.
Battle of Rhode Island and all, such on Patrick
Well,
Highland.
thank you.
And also,
Thank you.
too, we've made a commemorative coin that we're using as a
Very
way
nice.
for fundraising. So maybe an idea for you.
And I actually am carrying one from the. Who is that one?
Well,
from?
that's from the
Sons of the Revolution.
Sons of the Revolution. There
And
you go. Very good.
I have another one from the Gloucester County Emergency Response Team who gave me this when we were doing the project.
Well, very good. And then maybe we can put this up here, too, as a
Oh,
Battle
very
of Rhode
good.
Island pin.
Thank you very
All right.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much, everyone.
Thanks.